As the title of the webinar indicates, the discussion today is on pure public goods versus constitutional theory of public goods, what it means for the size of government. And we'll have a presentation shortly. But before that, the IEA is a public policy think tank, and our mission is basically to inform decision making in Kenya through policy, innovation, research, dialogues. We work across 6 program areas, and we are glad that you're able to join this discussion today. So for purposes of the webinar today, we'll have a presentation that will be in 2 parts. The first part will be on pure public goods versus constitutional theory of public goods, and that will be done by Leo Kemboi, who is a program officer at IEA in the Law and Economy program. And then we will have the second part, which will be a discussion on what it means for the size of government. And this part of the presentation will be done by Kwame Owino, who is the CEO of IEA. So with that said, I'll invite the first speaker, Leo, to make the presentation. Leo.
Just one moment. Good morning, everyone. My name is Leo Kemboi. I'm a program officer for the Constitutional Law Program. The focus of today's conversation would be on the public goods, the pure public goods versus the constitutional theory of public goods and what it means for the size of government. So that will be generally the outline. We'll look at what is the constitutional theory of public goods, what is the pure public good definition in economics, how different is the constitutional approach from the economic approach, and then looking at the efficiency question, and then we come to the part of the discussion. Now, in essence, to kick off the discussion, there's a new body of work around what constitutional scholars are calling the constitutional theory of public goods. And this is that while there is an economic definition and those public goods already have what we call the inherent characteristics, on the other part, the constitutional scholars assert that people within a territory can make a decision to, in their constitutional charter, in their charter, to make it explicit which goods are public goods at the constitutional level. And then and the major argument around that is that there'll be a decision on how that enjoyment that enjoyment of those public goods that on one side, while this is a political, they are making it a political question. On the other side, they are saying that that enjoyment of the enjoyment of public goods is also dependent, should not be dependent on any other person, but for the whole republic. Then another issue again is that this theory provides a basis and saying that government should provide public goods where there is significant demand, and also where those benefits are, even though whether those benefits are not non-rival and non-excludable. And then again, that theory focuses on a fixed population and is largely focused on government providing public goods. But before we delve in, we need to distinguish the two. So we provide a definition for what is pure public goods and how economists understand public goods, and actually what that means for service how they are provided. So the public goods was derived by an economist called Paul Samuelson, and Paul Samuelson is the first Nobel laureate, but again, he's considered the first father of modern economics. And I know majority of economists now learned the economics from textbooks developed by Paul Samuelson. But Paul Samuelson wrote a paper in 1954 and providing now, looking at how governments at that time were providing both different types of goods, noted that there are goods that that are underprovided in societies, and these goods, in most cases, the marginal cost is higher than the marginal benefit. And when the the costs are higher than benefits, the incentive to recoup profits, to recoup the costs is not there, and people do not, and private sector players never ended up providing those services. So in that market, in those societies, those public goods were not provided for. And in his own assessment at that time was that only these goods can be provided by governments. And therefore he developed a typology. And in that typology, he provided the reasoning and by defining the inherent characteristics. Looking, for example, distinguishing, just to give one example, that while there are things like controlling diseases, infectious diseases in a society, that would not be a private sector player would not be able to make investments in that area. But private sector players can make investments in the area of medicines, manufacturing of medicines, because one single shot, for example, like for a vaccine, the private sector player can recoup because that is a private good. When that shot is provided for one individual, it's not available for the other. But the overall goal of disease control is something that government does. So, and that's why he defined public goods around it's around two characteristics. Non-excludable. It's difficult to prevent people from using it, even if they don't pay for it. Non-rival. One person using it does not diminish another person's enjoyment, and that's why they suffer. Public goods normally suffer from what we call a free rider problem, because those people, for example, because government is funded largely through taxes, other people might not end up contributing directly for taxes, but end up does not but end up enjoying that service. And Samuelson provided 4 categories of together with another economist called Richard Musgrave, and provided a clear 4 different types of goods. One of them being a private good, a public good, common resources, and club goods. So things such as, for example, if you get onto expressway, that's a toll road. So that's a club good. It's only available for a club good. Common resources. So like if you're fishing in a river, private goods is those goods that once it's available for one person, it's not available for the others. But of interest on public goods, at that time when there was a big debate it was because of they wanted to limit government to provide goods that are very essential, but are not provided because private sector players cannot get into that space. But again, also to limit the size of that government for that government to be able to achieve optimal outcomes. So I'm giving one example of a public good here. So like publicly available data from Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, public good, non-rivalrous. Public data does not affect or reduce information available to others, not excludable, non-excludable, preventing others from it. You cannot. It's difficult to prevent others from accessing that data because it's publicly available. So, and then we again make that that in a free market, a public good always is mostly undersupplied because it's non-rivalrous and non-excludable. There is an economic proof. There is a proof on how these properties create that incentive not to pay, and that's why it's important that this come directly from these investments come directly from government. Kwame will speak into that at the end. Now, what is the difference between the two approaches? On the one side, as you said, the constitutional approach is political. It's a political rule. It's dependent on actually what people have decided in a constitutional moment, and it shifts that focus from inherent properties to the decision making by saying that this is something that society needs, irrespective of whether the inherent characteristics actually relies on those inherent characteristics does not necessitate government involvement in that in provision of that good. And again, it's also the argument is that when people collectively decide at constitutional level, that enjoyment is highly interdependent. So, and another difference is they believe that when for the constitutional approach, everyone benefits when everyone has access, regardless of whether that good is excludable or rivalrous. And again, at the macro level, people are dependent. People agree that the enjoyment of that good depends on everyone having access to it. So they'll say, for example, education. It's a private good. The investment in education, the benefits of education are recouped by an individual, but not by the society. But they see having a better educated population is better than that. And then the last one is when they choose to make a public good at constitutional level, they are actually making government participate in larger areas, in more areas of the economy, and also in providing public services. And this is different from the economic approach. And the economic approach only provides a basis that governments should only intervene in the economy when there are market failures. But in strict view of the economic approach, government should only participate in the economy to provide public goods. But where there is a market failure, and when a market failure is, so for example, when things such as when there is market failures, there are things that causes market failure. So failure, so like one of them being things such as information asymmetry, things that make the market not to work in an efficient manner. Then, what now, having gone through the differences between the two, what does the constitutional theory of public goods, what it doesn't do? So one thing is that when the constitutional theory assigns public goods characteristics to private or club goods, it does not change the inherent nature of those goods. And that is something that these economists, these constitutional scholars concede, that we are not changing the characteristics, the inherent characteristics of those goods. So what they only do is to change the nomenclature for how the Constitution views them. And it's for one simple reason, because they want to make a justification for how public finances can be expended and making investments in these goods. But strictly, but again, just to focus, the constitutional theory of public goods, it doesn't magically transform something like a private good. So, for example, like gym membership into a pure public good like national defense. It does not make them equal. What they're only saying is they think that they recognize that there are things that are the publicness of a good, and that publicness of a good. So, like for example, I've given, so like the example you gave, we're giving here is the economic and social rights in the Constitution. Most of those rights in the Constitution are private goods, but most of them, the Kenyan public, in recognizing that those are important things, say that this is a matter of political and constitutional choice, but not just inherent economic characteristics. And then they highlight that these scholars again highlight that these certain goods, while possessing some private goods traits, can be elevated to a public good status within a constitutional framework. And that elevation is on two grounds. One, even if the consumption is excludable, the good might be deemed essential for well-functioning of a society. And that's, we've given an example of education. Again, another issue is that access might be inherently linked to protecting fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution, such as healthcare or legal representation. Or so, for example, like the Constitution on the Bill of Rights require that the Constitution on Legal Bill of Rights require that where people are not able to be represented by an advocate of their choice, that there is a constitutional basis for them to be provided with legal representation in the name of a public defender. So that could be a public defender. So that is a distinction that it's just changing nomenclature. It's not changing the constitutional theory of public goods. Does not change inherent economic characteristics. They also concede that these goods are just being elevated for the welfare of the society. That the collective, because people believe that collective view around the importance of the Constitution is to elevate societal welfare. And so yes. Now, so Samuelson in that 1954 paper provided what we call the Samuelson rule, and this has endured over time. So the optimal provision of a public good occurs when the marginal benefit is equivalent. The marginal benefit is where the marginal costs is when the marginal cost is higher than the marginal benefit. That is a justification for the government to come in and provide those public goods, because in any case, when the marginal benefit is equivalent to the marginal cost, private sector players always can provide for that. When the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, those mostly fall in the category of private goods, because private sector players are incentive driven, and they're incentive driven just like any other farm behavior, just like any other farm. Their main existence is to maximize shareholder value, and maximizing that shareholder value necessitates them to actually go into markets that allows them to recoup those profits. So just to give an example that you are deliberating, an extensive public sewer from one end of Nairobi to the other might not be something that private sector players are keen on, but that is something that government of Kenya could provide for, because one person might not, first due to property constraints, where he lives, all these manner of things, and given that the government is the only player that is given constitutional rights, those inherent rights of to compulsory acquire land, those are things the private sector player might find it difficult to go into. But if government provides that, in the long run, it allows them to first make those costs cheaper, but in the long run make that public good efficient, because it's a public good because it's tied again to things such as water and sanitation, amongst others. Back to you, Jackie. Now we go into that discussion. What does each approach mean for the size of government? Kwame.
Kwame?
All right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. So far, Leo has taken us through what is called the constitutional theory of public goods and the pure theory of public goods, which is basically pure public goods. And the main distinction is that constitutional theory of public goods comes from the fact that these are goods or services provided by government on account of a constitutional requirement. So they may not be pure public goods in the sense that they're non-rival and non-excludable, but if the state or if the constitution provides that certain goods should be provided, then obviously government may provide them or may pay for them, pay for their provision. And that makes it, therefore, constitutional public goods in quote marks. On the other hand, a pure public good meets those two very strict criteria. One, it's non-rival in the sense that one person's consumption does not diminish the quantity that's available. So the quantity is not fixed, and it's not diminished. And the second one is non-excludable, which means you cannot fence off people from it. And the kind of goods that meet this specific qualification are very few. And the first among them would be something like national defense. Most countries have one coordinated national defense, which provides protection for the entire country or for the territory. Other goods and services that are said to have public goods character would be, for instance, stormwater control, and which we as Nairobians could tell a couple of months ago, stormwater control and flood control. Now, these are huge public works that require government investments. It is unlikely that a private sector person would invest for the same reason that Leo made, which is where marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost, a private sector person would go because the benefit can be attributed to a single person, and therefore you can charge that single person. With that, it is possible for private sector then to calibrate a profit for every individual, every unit that consumes it. That attribute is not possible for a pure public good, because in the place of a pure public good, when you're managing stormwater, it might pass through a neighborhood, it might pass through big areas. It is not possible to manage it in such a way that you will calculate the marginal benefit for every household, for every individual, whatever it is, and therefore calibrate a profit on that basis. For that reason, then, it is immensely difficult, not necessarily impossible, but it's immensely difficult to justify private investment in a public good. And therefore, this simple classification tells us why, or there's an affinity for that provision. But if we've taken the constitutional theory of public goods, which says that fine, those pure public goods might exist, but we have chosen on the basis of constitutional consensus to decide that we are going to make other goods the responsibility of government. And therefore, it's not a question of exchange between private bodies, but it's going to be a responsibility that government takes additionally. Meaning that it is the public goods that exist plus additional goods that we will call the constitutional public goods. What that means necessarily then is that it has implications for the size of government. And what is the size of government? The size of government is basically can be measured from a standpoint of a student of economics in 4 ways. One would be basically total government expenditures. We claim that if you want to understand government policy is actually where government places resources. Basically, what does government spend money on? So it's spending on fertilizer. You can say that's a fertilizer policy, and that's one of the things the government does. Whether that is a public good or not is a different question altogether. So 4 ways for measuring government size. One is expenditures, because that tells you what the government outlays would be. The second is revenues, because government spends from the revenue that it collects. The third is the public debt, because the revenue and deficits, which are funded by public debt, tells you what additional resources government needs after it has collected the revenues in order to spend. And the final one is employment. The number of people that government employs is also a question of the size of government, because those people then are not able to work in the private sector. They'd be working supposedly for the provision of the public goods, as we've argued, whether they're pure public goods or whether they're additional constitutional public goods. So if you have that, and as Leo has as Leo has explained to us, if you have constitutional public goods, and most constitutions tend to add to public goods size, to the public goods provision, then that means obviously the government has to be bigger, because if it was only providing the pure public goods, there are very few. National defense, for instance, public protection, resolution of cases, enforcement of contracts, it tends to be a very, very small number of things. So the first thing that will happen is that the implications of the expanded view of public goods, which is the constitutional theory of public goods, added to what the pure public goods would be, has 4 implications. So the first is it has implications for size of government, as I mentioned. Part of that, of course, which is in pending bills and public debt. So that's the public debt side. It has efficiency costs on taxation, because taxation for every student of economics has costs, because tax means your taxation of a transaction, whether it's an employment transaction between employee and employer, and if you raise a tax on that, it has consequences for how that employment contract is done. And it also has implications for property rights. Why? Because government funds the provision of public goods, whether the constitutional kind or the additional public goods by truncating property rights. It says you have your right to your property, but you're going to take part of your income, you're going to take part of your transaction fees, you're going to take property and use them for the provision of values. In other words, government tells you to truncate or basically subordinate individual, farm, or household interests to the interest of the provision of public goods. So that's the political connection. Each of those, of course, has consequences for behavior, whether at individual, whether at household, or definitely as well at farm level. But the main argument we're making here is that the expanded view of public goods outside the pure view has consequences, and these are the 4 consequences as we've stated them here. So it determines the target size of government, it creates pending bills and public debt, it has efficiency, cost of taxation, and obviously it has implications for property rights. And remember, the same laws that provide the constitutional order that often establishes government and assigns to it those roles that we call constitutional public goods also sometimes protects rights. So the first thing you see that here is that an expanded view of government has significant consequences for how property rights are going to be protected. So let's go to Kenya's case. If you come to Kenya's case, so we will start by asking ourselves, I have told you what the constitutional public goods are. And one of the ways of measuring the size of government is to ask yourself, what is government buying and what is government paying for? We all know that in Kenya, the government of Kenya employs about 1 million, slightly more than 1 million people. The total public sector is 1 million people working in all different areas. So apparently providing either the pure public goods or the additional public goods. Now, we also know that I think how budgets are constructed, sometimes the constitution might not necessarily require those public goods specifically, but government using the authority to tax and government using the authority to collect and execute certain projects or develop policy, could develop policy in which they suggest or intimate that certain things should be provided as a matter of urgency. It might be fertilizers, it might be critical things. And by doing that, definitely, government has a justification coming from that constitutional authority to then expand the kind of services that it does, therefore giving that impression. And this is where I say that you hear people say or call certain things public goods, but often what that means is that this is what they would prefer government necessarily to spend on, or what government is already spending on. But that does not make them by itself a public good. And I think Leo made that connection quickly. So here we are looking at the government's budget for 2024-2025. And what you're seeing here is basically the amount of money that's been assigned to specific departments within the national government alone. So we'll see that. And what this slide 10 shows you, and slide 11, which will come up, the lines that we've ticked in red, yes, it's very clumsy marking, but the lines that we've ticked in red are the things which in our judgment would constitute pure public goods provision. And the first thing that you will see is that the national government has 77 different functions and departments all the way. And this is not before we even speak about the state corporations. So we're talking about the government. So this ministry, the executive branch, Ministry of Sports, whatever it is. And then we've taken the pure public goods definition and asked ourselves, if we go line by line and try to provide checks, those red checks that we provided clumsily, we should learn to write better. But those red checks that you see here are the specific ones that qualify as specific, or rather as pure public goods, given the economics theory of public goods, which has, it's not just theoretical, but it has implications for how that industry is organized. So for instance, if you're talking about a public good in prosecution of crime or crime prevention or defense of the national territory, then obviously the economics and the farm behavior is determined by the fact that this is a good that is shared. Basically, it's non-excludable and non-liable, and it had to be organized in that way. And that's why government may have legitimate authority, even from an economic standpoint, and not necessarily the private sector. Now, we identified here 77 different departments or functions that government has identified. So each of them has a vote head. And of those 77, we found out that specifically, if you count the red checks that we have on the ticks, of those 77, only 25, which is purely 1/3 of all the other functions. So all these other functions suggest that government in Kenya, or those who support government, perhaps parliament together with the executive, has this expanded view. And if you look at it carefully, what we tried to do was to ask ourselves those basic functions. Protection, regardless of whether it is replicated. So for instance, we count both the judiciary, which obviously has law enforcement functions, the Ministry of Interior, the police force, the Independent Police and Oversight Authority, all putting all those together. And it is difficult to go beyond 25 or 77 functions. So the first thing that this tells you is that the size of Kenya's government is, to a large extent, determined. So whether in terms of people who work, remember each of these departments has people who work, and they're spending public money on a day-by-day basis. So the first thing that it tells you is that if you take the limited, confined theoretical definition of public value, then the state of Kenya would probably just have 25 departments. the national government level, right? Including, of course, the executive, and we've also counted the judiciary. The executive and the executive, the judiciary, and obviously parliament and parliament's functions as well. So it tells you that this map here tells you that the footprint of government of Kenya goes beyond the specific definitions of public goods, and that might be for good or bad reason. But the first thing that it tells you is that we have a more elaborate government structure than a pure theory of public goods would recommend. So that's the first thing. So 25 out of 77. So let's go to the next. So what is the government of Kenya? And I told you that there are many ways of measuring size of government, and of course, which is government's footprint and its economic effect. One of those is to look at the total budgets, right? Public spending. And if you look at it here, we have a trend line telling us from this year's estimates. So total spending, not necessarily total budget, we call it budget, but it's total spending, is 4.6 trillion for the year 2024-2025. So the year for which we've had one quarter completed at the end of September, 4 trillion shillings. And budget as a share of the gross domestic product. So the total spending as a share of all value created, of all wealth created in Kenya in 2024-2025, we expected 24. In other words, for every 100 shillings of value, the state in Kenya, through those functions that it has represented, both county, national government, and executive, judiciary, and parliament together, would be spending 24. Spending 24% on the services provided by 1 billion and a bit people. So that's one other way to scale it. And then, of course, the others are the rest of the money, 76%, is what's available in what we call the private sector, right out there. All those functions, whether small businesses, big businesses, and all that. If you scale down by asking yourselves, okay, so government is spending 4 trillion per year. What is that 4 trillion per person? So what's its effect per person? And you see here that in 2024-25, the government of Kenya would be spending the equivalent of 78,000 shillings in nominal value per person. 78,000 shillings, 890. So just about 79, slightly less than 80,000 shillings per person per year. If you know that this is 20,000 shillings, if you know that this is 25% of 1/4 of all public value created, then it's telling you that the average value created by Kenyans is about slightly more, just about 290. I mean, slightly less than 300,000, right? So 300,000 is available in value added per person per year in Kenya, and government of Kenya is taking 78%. I mean, 78,000 shillings, which is 24% of that total. And then we've gone back to actually argue that yes, if you want to understand the trend, the numbers that you're comparing in the third row are basically nominal numbers. And so over the last 2 years or so, it's not possible to show whether that number is going up or down on account of the fact that inflation has been happening. And if you take, for instance, that in 2023, inflation was particularly high, closer to 10% or thereabouts. So we've scaled it by asking ourselves, what's the specific amount that will be spent if you take back the value, strip out the value of inflation, and ask ourselves, we are using 2022 shillings, right? How much would be spending based on 2022 shillings? And as you can see, 2022, 66,047. In 2023, the equivalent would be 81,000. And in 2024, the equivalent would be 68,000. So it's showing you that the government of Kenya is spending about 2,000 more than it spent in 2023, 2023 over time. So it's telling you that the amount of money that the government of Kenya is spending is actually, in nominal terms, increasing, even if its share as a total of the gross domestic product reduced by about 2 percentage points. So in 2024, the government of Kenya would expect to have taken a little bit more money. But what this is telling you is just basically arguing the size of government as conditioned by the fact that we have a constitutional order which is interpreted as allowing government to provide constitutional public goods separate from the pure public goods. And you've seen that about 25 of 77, only 25 of 77 provide what would be the pure public goods. So the rest are other goods that are not necessarily public goods, but they're provided because of consensus at national level, consensus between the executive and the parliament, or necessarily what the constitution has required. So that's here. In the next slide, we then ask ourselves, so here we want to see what the revenues and the public, I mean, to decompose by asking ourselves what's the outcome. And so we see the total revenue and grants that government would receive for 2024, 25, as you can see in the third column, going downwards, would be 3.26 billion, which is basically 3.626 trillion in terms of total revenue and grants, of which there's 3 trillion per 3.16 trillion, which would be the expenditure over the, I mean, the total revenue collected over the 12 months, of which ordinary revenue is 2.7, local appropriations in aid, and of course, grants the government expects to receive. So you're seeing here again that the total revenue is growing. Remember, we are saying that this is providing both pure public goods and the other constitutional public goods. So this is size of government determined by that. Now, when I say that 25 of the 36 of 77 departments would not qualify, I'm saying that we are at this level on account of the fact that 77 units of the national government are available, including parliament and the executive and judicial services, judiciary, on account of the fact that there's a provision that allows government to spend beyond the strict provision of public goods. And so the thing we're hammering, or the thing we hope to persuade you as we wade into these weeds, is to show how the concept and the interpretation of what the Constitution allows has what its consequences are for taxation and what its consequences are for government organization, the size of government, and how it's all planned and executed. So on the top side, you're seeing revenues collected, which is government's claim on citizens' incomes, transactions, and all that. And then on the other side, at the bottom part, you see the expenditure and how much government is spending. So total discretionary expenditure is 2.8. It's gone up by 10.9. Remember, revenues have grown by 5.1. Total government revenues have grown up by 5.1, but total discretionary expenditure has grown up by 10.9. So you're seeing that expenditures are chasing revenues, of which the national executive itself would be spending 2.3 trillion, a 12% rise in that. So again, see this as national executive executing functions related to the provision of those constitutional public goods going out there. National executive's share of that growth has gone up by 12%. We have the equalization fund, which was cut down after the supplementary budgets from 10 billion shillings to 8. So the equalization fund goes down. Parliament's share was supposed to go up by, I mean, from 39 to 44, 12.5. Obviously, after the finance bill failed to pass, this was truncated back down to, so it was just barely about, I think, 3 or 4% up. The contingency fund went up from 1.2 billion to 5 billion, remained at that level, but you can go and see that it went up by 76%. This contingency was itself conditioned by the fact that when the floods came and also the devastation that it caused, the absence of preparedness actually allowed, or rather persuaded people in the public sector that the contingency fund ought to be expanded. And therefore, that's a justification. The judiciary initially are spending 18 billion per year. These are core functions of the public sector, and public goods, in our view, went back to 24, had required or initially assigned about 24 billion. And this was suddenly, which would be 23%, but this was subsequently cut down. So I think the growth in expenditure for the judiciary was less than 10%. And then county governments initially 423 billion was supposed to go up to 444 by 4.6%. Remember, public county governments also perform certain core functions, say, for instance, the provision of water sanitation services, some public health services, of course, some of which are public goods, and some of them are just goods that are good to have and useful for social welfare, but are not necessarily strictly public goods. And then there's the non-discretionary expenditure, which is the interest on debt at 1 trillion, the debt itself, pensions and other, interest on debt is 1.1 trillion, the debt itself was about 900. And then pensions and other would be pensions for retired public service workers, who then, as you can claim, have provided public goods in earlier periods, and are therefore entitled to a pension at the end of their service. So what this picture tells you is basically how government structure, spending, and the funding models are determined by that decision about where government responsibilities and where government should be. And you see that the bigger the footprint that government has, obviously it has implications for the expenditure side, it has implications for revenue, and revenue is about taxation, which is obviously a size of government question. And if government has 77 units, 77 departments or different spending centers which are vote heads, then it's also telling you the number of people within those 77 units have to be reflected in the amount of money that will be paid, and obviously the employment that comes with that. The next slide. Here it's reflecting pending bills. Remember, we said that one of the ways in which you measure the size of government is basically the number of employees, the public debt, the revenues and expenditures. And we handle revenues and expenditures and a little of public debt. But there's a hidden form of public debt in the Republic of Kenya that we'd like to expose for significant reasons. One is who's running that public debt. And public debts, basically pending bills, are that expenditure item that a department, agency, or ministry have, or even a county, have expenditure that has happened, but for which the payment is due. So obviously that reflects on the public purse, and that reflects. So this is not a very clear picture. We should have made it more clear. But what it's telling us here is by public sector pending bills by June 2024, compared to June 1 year earlier, which is June 2023. And what you can see here is that on the recurrent side, ministries, departments, and agencies of government, so that's national government, owed 87 billion in pending bills in 2023, June, and this had moved to 100 billion, 12% change, in 2024. So that shows that on the executive or rather national government level, debt on recurrent expenditures have gone up. And remember, recurrent expenditures tend to be what? Tends to be wages. So it means that the wages that are owed, that were pending, was almost 100 billion, and had grown by about 12.5%, 12.8%. Interesting. And then on the other side, the development side was almost flat, just about the same, about a reduction of 0.5, about 1% less. So it stayed the same, but the wage component of the debt or the pending bills have grown. And pending bills are debt. They're not really considered national debt, but they're debt because they're due and for payments. I think this is partly driven by delays in salaries and that provision here. But the second part that I'd like to look at is the state corporation side. I'll finish in a bit there. So look at this. So these are state corporations. Remember, state corporations are parastatals, are those bodies that have been established again by government to provide all manner of services, some of them business and commercial services. So there'd be anything from the provision of electricity, providing airport services, providing airlines, all those things that government undertakes outside the core public services, but which are state corporations. We call them parastatals in Kenya. But it's not just how much they owe, which, as you can tell here, the subtotal for recurrent is 144 in 2024, and this has reduced from 188. But the point is this: if you look at the items that they owe, so for instance, these state corporations, those parastatals, owe pay-as-you-earn of 19 billion. So in other words, a state corporation owes government. So government owing itself money, government running debt against itself. So state corporations owe pay-as-you-earn, which is basically, I think, pending payments of taxes that are due to the Revenue Authority. So here is one state corporation owing the Revenue Authority 19, a collection of them owing the Revenue Authority. So government owing itself. Do you see how this circulation of debt through the justification of provision of public services are known as NSSF, which is the National Social Security Fund, again, about 600 million. The National Hospital Insurance Fund, unremitted SACCO deductions. Otherwise, these government departments have deducted and then did not remit to SACCO. So that would probably be a private sector person. Then, of course, there are also personal arrears, pensions arrears, people whose pensions are due and are not being submitted. But the reason, the reason that B part is important is most of that money is actually government owing itself cash. Of course, private sector firms that are owed by these also suffer for the reason that this money has not been paid and services provided or goods provided. But on the whole, what it tells you is the interesting bit where one government arm owes the other government arm. So the net worth of government is affected by the fact that one government arm owes the other government arm. And I don't know if you reconcile that. I'm not too sure that it creates a healthy balance sheet, as you can see here. And then when you come to county governments, you can see county governments have recurrent budgets, recurrent pending bills of 28 billion in 2023, which had risen to 143 billion by June of this year, which is a serious thing because it's telling you the delays in salaries payments and that. And then, of course, on the development side, which was 131, has been reduced. So what it looks like county governments have done is switched who they owe from owing businesses and outsiders, which was an order given by the Ministry of Finance or the Cabinet Secretary to prioritize pending bills so that businesses do not suffer. But what they've done by that is paying businesses and reducing that liability, but switch that liability and now owe their staff 143 billion. In other words, they've internalized the risk by owing staff, but paying the outsider who's owed the cash. So that's basically it. So we've seen this represents debt. In addition to the fact of all Kenyans know, Kenya's public debt as a share of GDP, I think right now is measured at about 68% or thereabouts, slightly less than it's been on account of the fact that the Kenya shilling strengthened. When the Kenya shilling strengthened in June, in February or thereabouts, the quantum of debt that is designated in foreign currency reduced substantially. But at the same time, it's about 68% of GDP. And if you add these 697 billion on top of that, it gets down to about more than 70% of GDP in debt, and that's quite a bit. So as I conclude, what are we saying here? The claim we've made is that one. Can I have the next slide? Yes. That it seems to be obvious when you say that constitutional models dictate the size of government. I think it does. However, it depends on how it is interpreted and what it allows. So, for instance, we know that there's a big argument in Kenya today about the housing, the affordable housing law and the levy that has come with it. Many Kenyans, some not, but many Kenyans think that it's unjustified for different reasons. The courts did not agree. And the interpretation, which I think is completely contrived, is the idea that because the Constitution has defined it as a right, the government of Kenya has therefore the responsibility to provide housing. There are 14 million housing units in Kenya. Most people have built their own houses without debt. But the government of Kenya has now chosen that we should have 1.5% paid by employees, another 1.5% paid by employers, and all that will be put together. And the government of Kenya has already collected, based on the declarations in the budget review and outlook paper, about 53 billion on account of the housing levy fund. 53 billion is equivalent. The government of Kenya collects about 8 billion per day in taxes, about slightly less than 9. That's equivalent to 6 days of revenue collection over the whole year, which is for housing. And as you can see, that's an additional tax, which has implications for size of government in the sense that expenditures, it has implications for debt, it has implications for taxes that people pay. But interpreting it in that way, which housing is definitely important investment for every household and every individual, but it by no means qualifies as a public good. So by that kind of interpretation, it determines the size of government. It has raised the size of government by 53 billion shillings in 1 year. And of course, as that collection continues, it's going to endure. So that's our first one. So regardless of that, the constitutional models dictate the size of government. Because second, people argue state capacity arguments. They bear consequences for property rights. And you hear Kenya's president who goes about that, yeah, looking shiny and using very flowery vocabulary, saying things such as development does not occur without resources. And we need to build state capacity and a state that is properly built and properly constructed should be able to provide these core things. Now, one of the things you must understand when he's making that claim is, the claim then is that government has rights to extract your property, and that property extraction is for the purposes of meeting that expanded view about what the role of government and constitutional public goods should be. I think that tension is not sufficiently appreciated. I think a few people might agree with me as well. I think some of my colleagues may, is that that's a very slippery slope of constitutional theory of public rights. I mean, the constitutional theory of public goods, because then anything else that people need critically and which government represents as provided in the Bill of Rights necessarily means the government provision must come. And it's a very slippery slope. It's actually even an absurd argument that the courts accepted. It shows courts have elevated understanding of economics than I do. But that's basically it. Because it could start with housing, it could go to food, it could go to anything else. I mean, we already have the view. Fertilizers certainly are good, but they're not public goods by all means. The government of Kenya provides it, and this year I think there was a provision of another 10, maybe 30 billion available for government to provide and to subsidize fertilizer. So you see how that slippery slope comes when you start an expanded view of what government responsibilities should be, because you have a liberal, an extremely liberal interpretation of the constitutional theories, then you create this. But the most important thing is not only the size of government, it has implications for property rights, which is how people earn income and how much of it they will keep. As you can see that with the National Social Health Assurance, or whatever that new acronym means. Now, I conclude with the view that the constitutional theory, however, of public goods does not compel government provision. But the usual, the dominant interpretation is that because the constitutional theory says this is it, we must provide it to government. So for instance, there is no requirement that because the constitutional provision says that government, for instance, even if you interpreted it as meaning that everybody, each of us is entitled, for the purposes of food security, to fertilizer provision or good fertilizer to provide for certain people. There's no reason that that should be interpreted as meaning that even if government thinks that should be, it should support that. It must necessarily establish a department for the distribution of fertilizer, right? But the public choice theory of economics, which tells us that bureaucrats, and here bureaucrats come all the way from the presidency back there, have an interest in interpreting those constitutional provisions, whether they interpret them right or not, as meaning that government should be expanded by creating new departments, and you have all manner of boards, state corporations, and all that. Why? Because it brings more influence and it brings more power within the control of government. And we think that is the trade-off that all of us as citizens of Kenya must understand. When we accept an expanded view of the constitutional theory of provision of public rights, we are surrendering property rights, because that's the first thing that will come in. We are talking about the justification for public debt, and it has implications for what government size overall will be like. And obviously, it's usually a tear towards much larger government than would be ideal. Thank you.
Okay. We've come to the end of the presentation. I will not attempt to summarize because I think the last speaker did that. We'll go straight to plenary and we'll allow you to ask questions. Anyone who has a question that you'd like to ask any of the speakers, you can raise your hand, direct it to either of the two speakers, and then we will have them respond. So I don't know if anyone would like to ask a question, seek a clarification from anything that was said. But before I can see any hand up, because I can't see any hands up, I'll go to the chat box. Oh, okay. So I see a hand up by Ona. Ona, would you like to please unmute yourself and ask your question? Michelle, I hope they can unmute. Thanks. Ona, please
Okay.
unmute
Yeah,
yourself.
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Jackie. I want to appreciate the presenters for the thought-provoking presentation. Listening to Kwame's presentation and, of course, Leo giving us a theoretical background, and I would just wish to know whether this is the trend across, because the presentation has focused on Kenya. And my thinking has always been that the bureaucrats are using the constitution, of course, to expand the definition of public goods for sometimes I think for reasons self-interest. Because when you look at the bureaucrats at the national government in our context, there are even certain functions which, okay, may not necessarily provide for public goods, but you find that they are still being undertaken by the national government, significantly so, even looking at the budget allocation for the same. A good example is health and probably provision of water. And so I would wish to get a feel, because I haven't read so much on this, but is this the common practice in other jurisdictions? Our peers in the developing world, is it the common practice that generally there's a behavior by bureaucrats to tilt the provision of public goods, maybe for purposes of self-interest, so that they then provide and enlarge the size of government for the purpose of self-interest, because clearly it goes with the budget, and in the budget is the money. So is it the interest in this money that is driving this? And it is shocking, because ideally only 50% of the functions that are provided by our government, in fact 25%, should be providing for public goods, meaning that the rest are either duplications or creations for reasons which I tend to think are self-interest. Is this the common practice in other jurisdictions? And probably what can we learn from other jurisdictions? Some comparison from the presenters. And then what else can the population do? Because it is the same constitution that provides a lot of rights to the citizen. And it is the same constitution that is being used by the bureaucrats, you know, to expand the scope of public goods. So what can the citizen do? Do we repeal the constitution altogether and have something else, or what do we do? And then secondly, what is the practice in other jurisdictions? Asante.
Thank you. Thanks, Ona. So as they prepare to respond to that, I see a few other questions. So this will be the first round. So Daisy had asked, when looking at the size of government and its expenditure, is there a recommended minimum spend that ought to go to government spending, sort of administration costs or government, or a maximum spend which ideally it should not exceed? Then Simon asks, what percentage of inflation, or what is the rate of inflation used to adjust the total budget per person? And then there's a question by Vincent. Vincent will share the slides after the presentation. So there's a question by Kelly. If expanding the constitutional theory of public goods is equal to more government spending, then it would follow that reducing this is equal to less government spending. But this assumes good faith by government and that they are spending this money solely because the constitution said they should. Is this truly the case for Kenya? So that's the question by Kelly. And then Otieno asks, what should we expect from KRA integrating tax system with banks, money remittance, and payment service providers like M-Pesa? So Leo, you can start. I see other hands up, but I'll come to you in the next round. So Leo, you can start pick any of the questions you'd like to respond to, then we'll come to Kwame.
Yes. I just had the comparative sense that Honor is asking, and one of the things that you notice is that advanced economies, with the exception of specific Nordic countries, have a smaller share compared to have a smaller share compared to that of spending as a share of GDP. And in those specific Nordic countries that have larger share as compared to GDP are very small countries. For example, others having something like 5 million people. And so those some specific things is that what we normally do to see that comparison, for us to compare like and like, is we normally say that when a country was in our stage of development. So for example, like I remember a good example that Kwame likes giving is the one of Germany. When it was at the income per capita was equivalent to Kenya, they're spending something like 9% of GDP to fund government. So that was a very small government. And that shows, and because at that time the pursuit was on the economy and bigger. Commonwealth will add more on that. On the one of Daisy, the question from Daisy, that looking at the size of government and its expenditure, whether there is a recommended minimum that ought to go to sort of administration to fund government. And that's the argument that we're trying to emphasize today, that government should only fund public goods. And from those public goods, now that would predetermine what share of spending would go to now, of course, that would be the minimum spend. And looking from the simple simulation we just shown of that 25 of 77 state departments would be funded, that means that at least something like government of Kenya would be able to save close to 1 trillion, 1.5 trillion in actual costs from the current budget if they were just to focus on that. And that would mean leaving all manner of things, including government selling meat, to government providing airline services, to government doing all these manner of things, including the machining complex, the numerical machining complex, which is almost like an assembly plant, to government providing cement. All government will get out of those, all the other things, because the focus will now be on those key public goods. So that will be the minimum. I'm thinking there is no recommended number, but what is clear is that government should only provide those public goods and stop providing those other private goods, including whether it's cement businesses, all the way to providing meat and airlines. So Kingori, the percentage of inflation, we used the headline inflation numbers from Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. So I'll just attempt to and then Kwame will provide more. That expanding constitutional theory of public goods is equals to more spending. That is true. Then it will follow that reducing that is equals to less spending. But assuming good faith by government and that they are spending this money solely on because the constitution they should. Is this truly the case for Kenya's constitution? See, if you studying public choice theory, tells you that largely governments, when they expand, government programs first, even those that are considered temporary programs, tend to stay on for for a longer period than it is. But secondly, that if the bigger role should be that expanded view has implications for rights. It has for property rights, because that expanded view means bigger appropriations, and bigger appropriations means more taxes, and that in itself. So that one also means that if if that fiscal policy is misspecified and the distortionary effects of taxes come onto the economy, that you'd largely see that a country ends up being a growth laggard. And this has been the case of Kenya, for example, because if you read the paper that was done by Kwame Maureen and Peter Doyle called the floods, it showed that by that fiscal policy misspecification happening, amongst other things, government of Kenya that only growth went up. The real per capita income went up by 25% between 1990 and in 30 years, 30 years from 1990. So there's there's nothing in public policy intentions. It's actually incentives or disincentives that come before people, because so that's the nexus, and I hope I've answered that. So comment.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So that well, okay. So first, Honor, we must agree that every country should obey its constitution, and that's why the constitutional consensus, when you establish it, is important. Now, if you remember, the American Constitution was drawn by people who were very parsimonious. They wanted government to play a very limited role, and they stated it. Of course, over time, the government has found ways to actually expand itself. In the United States, the income tax was not even a tax until this century, actually. Part of it was brought up as a mechanism for funding wars when the government started to was involved in the First and Second World War. But before that, basically, income taxes were actually a very late invention in US history policy. So maybe I use the US again. I think it's the one that has documented constitutional order. I mean, in a couple of years, it'll be 250 years. And any human creation that has gone on for 250 years is something that we should study keenly, for good and bad, necessarily. And so if you start from that, you see why. Even England, when England was holding empire all over the world, including running in this country, its total spending as a share of the gross domestic product in that country was, as Leo mentioned, less than 10%. And remember, it was running empires all over the world. And one of the things that people find interesting is how, quote unquote, and I say this advisedly, how efficient it was. The whole of India, which was 200 million people, was managed by 10,000 British men and women. That's a very efficient, even if evil, administration. I mean, what I'm trying to argue here is how clean those administrations were. I'm not arguing that it is therefore a good thing. I'm simply arguing that even these colonial administrations are. And so this huge escalation in government asking for more money is actually something that came with wars in the First and the Second World War. And when they rose, that's one. And then secondly, when government started to expand what is called the welfare state, and therefore needed more resources, and argued it as a question of redistribution. And so people got used to high tax rates. The unfortunate thing that they rarely come back down. And then political mobilization started to become a question of which political parties prefer higher taxation and which political parties prefer a different taxation model and what the size of government should be. So that's basically part of that history. So the common jurisdiction varies by constitutional order and what the preference is. Remember, a constitution is just basically a compact about how people decide we're going to govern ourselves. And if you want government to cook burgers for every child every day at home, then it means you're asking for a big government and you're actually encroaching on household decisions and all that. And that's the point we're trying to make. The point here is whatever constitutional interpretation we choose as the economic and social rights provide and how they're supposed to be provided. And if we accept, therefore, that it means the government should build us houses, provide us with means and all that, then it has implications for the size of government, our tax budgets, or our tax obligations, and you'll see the kind of encroachment that you're seeing from the KRA, where people actually believe that there's a lot of tax out there and that taxation by itself and the level of taxation is a reflection of success. It isn't. Economics textbooks teaches you that. But if we have that constitutional view, or the dominant view is that government drives growth and government drives development, and therefore is entitled to every single shilling that we earn or any property that we hold. And if we refuse to do that, then we are being unpatriotic, as some of the sermons from the president seem to suggest, then that means that's where we are going to. And if the courts uphold that, then that means that you've taken the view that when you define anything as a public good, the government is entitled to take money to provide it. That's the trade-off that we're asking us to understand, that meaning. So that's Daisy. There's no recommended minimum spend. Again, some countries actually have agreements, some others do not. And as you've seen, the president was in, and I mentioned this a lot because, yes, I'm concerned the president preaches this, give us more resources so we can give you development argument. And people buy it. There's a belief in Kenya that richer people and people, multinationals, are skiving a lot of tax. I don't believe it, but if KRA can find it, I'd be willing to go back on that, because there's nothing wrong in being corrected and accepting the fact. But that's the argument, that we went to Japan, we saw fast-moving trains, very clean cities, and in our case, Nairobi City and Nairobi would be much, much cleaner. The waters would be cleaner for the Nairobi water, if only we collected 40% of GDP as taxes. Good thinking and good luck, but I don't think that's how it is. However, whatever it is we accept about what the provision of public goods are, it has implications for size of government, implications for size of government in terms of taxes, in how much government borrows, and how government manages its affairs, and how many people are employed. So that's the point, Daisy. And when we do that, then we determine. And the size of government is not only taxes and what government spends, it's also what government borrows. And so we do that. Now, the rate of inflation, Simon, that we did was we used the annual rates of inflation. And remember, because we are correcting for the 2022 year, we compounded inflation for the last 2 years, right? So it was, I think it was 9 or 11% in 2022, and then in the subsequent year, 2023, it was about 9. So if you compound those, that's why the other figure is lower, because you need to compound the inflation rates to be able to create the same amount of dollars in terms of buying power. Kelly, you ask about, yes, that's it. I think the discussion in Kenya around how taxes are borne is something that I think the executive and parliament gets away with very, very easily. Partly because if you've seen the way the public sector has organized its taxes or its payments, if you look at it side by side, and SRC was supposed to solve this, they have not, because even they got sucked into this idea of allowances separate from whatever. They say that it is not true. Public sector allowances in Kenya are not subject to taxation. And that's why people prefer to travel a lot and do all manner of things. They're not subject to taxation. But if we accepted a smaller, or rather if we accepted the pure public goods, government should naturally be smaller, or at least they'd have more resources to do a few more things, but it should naturally be smaller, definitely, because that's what it says that you want a small government and less encroachment into other people's public affairs. I'll give you an anecdote. Over the last weekend, I had a trip somewhere, and then I was sitting at an airport somewhere in Kenya. I mean, this is not to show people that I travel, but I was sitting at an airport in Kenya, and I met certain members of parliament. And these members of parliament will be away, I think, for about 2 weeks because they're traveling this week. And they're saying how they're traveling to go and watch elections in the US. Now, apart from the irony that Kenyan politicians, where we can't even count 16 million votes and give us a clear answer, are going to watch elections in the US, they're actually funded by the public sector to go and watch elections in another part of the world. In my view, I don't think that's right, given competing influences, competing demands for Kenyan money. I don't think that's right, but maybe I'm wrong. So if you look at the kind of things, and that is funded by the public sector, we can ask ourselves, if we had a pure public goods approach, do we think it is the right thing for members of parliament performing a fundamental role, which is a public good? Legislation is a public good for national legislation, at activities that they undertake under that legislative thing, where they're all going up there, is a reflection of how public sector remuneration has been designed. And that brings us back to that public choice theory, where everybody in the bureaucracy tries to expand their roles by making sure that there's more money available for them to spend, whether it's for political influence or for any other thing. But I still find it ironic that Kenyan members of parliament, that it's not one, two, are going all over the world watching elections. I don't know what they teach anybody. So assume you're somewhere watching elections in Raleigh, North Carolina. What are you teaching them about how to count votes? But maybe there's something they can learn about how not to do it. My joke aside, Otieno asked a question about reducing GOK spending. Yes, it's very difficult. One of the things that you see, as you saw as well, the executive, which already takes much of the money that is spent, had its expenditure go up by 10%, which means it was matching inflation. Inflation was barely about 9%. So every year, people in the executive ensure, for good or bad, that the buying power of their income, regardless of what economic conditions are, goes up. And for some reason, they have this compact with Parliament, which allows them to get away with it. And for as long as we believe in Kenya that growth and public performance comes from resources spent by the public sector, it is not. For as long as we believe that, I think the constitutional theory will dominate. That argument about government needs more resources to fund it will drive public spending up. Because it's difficult, as Leo said, once you open those bottles and you design a remuneration system in which people earn a greater share, not everybody, but many people in the public sector earn a greater share of their income from allowances for attending meetings and all that stuff, then you have this conundrum, which means that public spending will have to go up. Thanks.
Okay, we go to the second round. I see a hand up by Kafira. I hope I am pronouncing your name right. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline, for the opportunity to ask a question. My question is directed towards Kwame. On the issue of public sector spending, look at the budget allocations like for last year and the previous years too. You find that education takes like a greater chunk at about, I think it was 650 billion. Health takes about, I think, 165 billion, if I remember correctly, give or take. So my question is, both health and education are not necessarily public goods. They're actually not public goods theoretically. So do Kwame or the IA takes the view that the government should minimize spending towards that, and minimize spending, and if it does that, then that means that health and education are left to the private sector. I understand that if it's left to the private sector, doesn't necessarily mean that it will be necessarily expensive for consumers, in quotes, consumers, because the market finds a way. The market finds a way for income levels, for consumers at the different income levels. But what would that mean for inequality in Kenya, given that we are still not at par with our peers in income levels? So what would that mean? Would it be okay for the government to continue expanding expenditure towards those areas, and on the other side taking more tax out of pockets, or it would be better if they just left it to the private sector and consider that inequality levels will rise for a given time before things readjust.
Okay. Thanks, Kafira. Ona, your hand is still up. Is this the previous question, or is your hand still up?
Sorry, I think I didn't lower it. It's okay.
Okay, all right. I think those are the only hands I see. So we then go to the chat box. Wafula asks, in Finland, there are no private schools, which implies that government offers this service to a standard for every child. Can we not have that in Kenya? Then Otieno asks again, kindly provide some insights into the Supreme Court case on the fate of the Finance Act 2023, your thoughts on how that is likely to go. And then Daisy, so how do we move away from taxing income? Okay, so because I don't see any other hands, I'll ask the presenters to respond to this and as you make your closing remarks. So we'll start with you, Leo.
Yeah. So one of the so just to add, I know that question is going to come, but I just want to add one nuance. See, at present, education takes, it's true, a bigger chunk of costs. But again, the bigger question should be how education can be provided, because you spoke about equity, and one of the things I've been studying lately is about equity, that inequality. And inequality, the big problem with inequality in education is there are likely a set of preferred schools, for example, for secondary education, that are considered national schools and largely well-resourced compared to the other schools. And these schools take a smaller population of Kenyan children, and you end up creating a system that cannot be equitable from the word go. Other studies have shown that, for example, that abolishing boarding schools could bring equitable outcomes in the education sector. But I just ended because that is something that I thought I could say. On the question by Otieno Victor, what we should expect from KRA integrating tax systems with banks, money remittances, and payment service providers. I think the question of there is a constitutional provision of privacy, and that privacy, public goods are not just physical or tangible commodities. They also include standards and measures. So one of them, like right to privacy, that privacy right is a public good. There's a reason why the Constitution requires that before Kenya Revenue Authority, or any other law enforcement agency, before they get hold on to any information, they have to go to a judge and explain the rationale for that. And if they don't, always all that evidence is inadmissible. So even if KRA integrates, and by the way, Parliament cannot re-legislate constitutional provisions, especially those ones in the Bill of Rights, by trying to truncate or have those constitutional principles like right to privacy have very minimal have an effect that is not what was provided in the Constitution. So you will see when this issue goes before a court of law, because now it's past parliamentary oversight. Now that privacy question, and now Kenya Revenue Authority would make provisions to administer taxes for this tax procedure mechanism, that will be set aside because it fails that test. Because already at present, if KRA wants to conduct audits, they always look at all your bank accounts and this and everything else. So this level of automation is something that will breach all the other constitutional rights. I'll leave that question by Namutola so that Kwame can answer together with the question that was asked by Honor, why Finland, there are no private schools, because it's a similar question. So, Tiana Victor, we cannot preempt the court. The court will make it on the question about how the Supreme Court might rule on the Finance Act 2023, how it's likely to this likely to go. We'll wait for the decision and then evaluate that decision and its merits. Question on Daisy. So how do we move away from taxing income? So we have a study on the IEA website on study on optimal taxation, equity and optimal and also on optimal taxation. And the big issue that we've learned by looking at other comparable jurisdictions and also just evaluating our own taxes, how debt weight losses are created by raising rates from one way or the other, is that one thing that we've learned, because Article 209 provides for the types of taxes, and one of them includes income tax as part of what national government can charge. The only thing that we can help with is to make an argument that we should have that first tax rate should be low, meaning that, and then secondly, we should have one lump sum tax, so like a fixed 18% or 20%, and then keep that tax rate there for a very long period of time, and only review those taxes when evidence suggests that that revision will not yield any distortion or impede economic activity. So that's the rationale. So we've written like the overall rule on how taxation principles should be approached from, especially in the Kenyan context, having looked at not just the constitution, also the Kenyan law, and also generally the economic data. So people can check out that. I think that's a very interesting question. So in conclusion, there is a clear case of why public services, there's a clear case for why government should only focus on public goods, and especially in the Kenyan context, given the way we've seen both private sector players and people in government have come out to exploit the largesse of government to benefit themselves. So we should even look at this issue of pure public goods as a governance measure on how to actually deal with governance issues, because when you reduce those state agencies, state corporations that are just responsible for a larger part of pending bills, and the rate of return on investment is negative, you might improve public sector outcomes by allowing people to have that more disposable income, but also the ability to protect those property rights. So in essence, we should look at this as by forcing government to go to those pure public goods. Additionally, there's something that Kwame emphasized that I'd also like to reemphasize on the issue of public sector. Where the Constitution has said one thing, especially that on public service provision, people always take it that government must provide it. Government could also pay other players to do that. And lastly, and lastly is also that the question that was asked about that whether healthcare, the whole of healthcare is a public good. There are elements of it that are private goods, there are others that are public goods. One of them, like disease control, is a public good. So I end at that, and we should all be expect to see more issues around public goods from the IEA. Back to you, Kwame.
All right. Can I go?
Yes, Kwame.
Yes.
Fine. So let me start with Daisy, because Daisy, you asked a question. When I say that the US didn't have an income tax until more recently, I did not mean that we shouldn't. I mean, we have income tax laws, and of course, abolishing income tax in Kenya would be a little difficult because of all taxes. About 40% of income actually comes from income tax. And that is income tax, which is people's labor, before you talk about income tax from corporations. About 60% of all income is actually income taxes, one way or the other. So it will be difficult. It's not impossible, it will be difficult. I don't see the ethos in Kenya in that belief that reducing taxes is necessarily usually considered a good thing, except for Gen Zs who reminded us that, look, we don't have to take every tax because anybody, and even that was fashioned as part of the reason I suspect it resonated was that people fashioned it as a push by the IMF. But I think we have a very aggressive state in terms of income tax. And I see sometimes even Kenya's media say that KRA is successful because it's collected more money from people. I see it as, look, what it has done is actually successful truncated your property rights, your ability to determine how to use your own income. But maybe that's ideological. Now, in my view, and I think this is a general question for those who've asked us, in my view, it is possible that government of Kenya could reduce, or rather restrict itself to common public goods, to pure public goods, and get a good outcome, a better outcome. Even if it does not reduce taxes, it means the government of Kenya will spend more money, more efficiently on the things that it needs to do. Because one of the things that I think, if you have 77 departments and another 400 state corporations, which is as parastatals, one of the things that you know is the government of Kenya is spread too thin, trying to do every little thing and doing most of them very badly. So our nudge for concentrating on what the pure public goods are for two reasons. One, there's an efficiency argument, as has been argued, but even more importantly, it allows governments to concentrate on the things which it can do best. There's no reason. And you remember, just before we had the changes in the cabinet secretary for finance, Professor Dumu, mentioned that one of the things that makes him nervous about the state corporations, because their return on investment was 0.1%. In other words, you invest 100 shillings and you're getting 0.1 out of that. Basically negative returns before you even consider. So some of those things would be closed and Kenya would be none the worse. But getting that a problem. And the second one is we tend to argue that government should exist as employment as an end in itself. You had some members of parliament, they were ridiculed quite a bit, but they were making these decisions that, look, the cabinet secretary's positions are important because those people will contribute to taxes. And this brings me to the question which somebody has asked here, was it Vincent? Let me read that, which is that, yes, Ngeno says that, Titus, you say you missed my point because I was saying that travel alliances for the public sector, does it mean that it is not? No, travel alliances, there's a threshold for travel alliances. What I meant was this, that there's an imbalance in the compensation model that the public sector receives because the travel allowances are huge. And sometimes the people who receive travel allowances, or even just allowances in general, that are equivalent to sometimes multiple of their incomes every month. What that does is it gives them a perverse incentive to do the kind of things where people go to Naivasha to write a report and to assess procurement of a good, and then they come back and then they go back again to write the final report and stuff like that. All those perverse incentives are generated from the way the public sector has designed its compensation mechanism. That was the point. But it's also true that many of them collect it in cash, including members of parliament and other people. So that's one of the things that makes that That's the point that we were making. But what I want Kenyans to understand is this. You often hear people say that, that arguments such as government can employ people and then those people will pay taxes. That's a very, very, very illiterate way to frame an economics problem. Everybody who works in the public sector, from our sweeping lady in a department all the way to the presidency and all there, are net recipients of taxes. So the reason we measure the size of government by the number of employees, it'll tell you that we have 3 million employees in Kenya's formal sector. It means that those 1 million in government are supported by the wages coming from the 3 million, from the 2 million on the other side. So the share of number of government employees to the rest of the working population is one of the ways in which you measure the burden of government. They don't pay net taxes, they're net receivers of taxes. Why? Because when government tells you that we've employed, including teachers, district commissioners or whatever their names are, county commissioners, and then tells you that we pay them X 100,000 shillings and then we deduct 2,000 shillings. It is the same operation, switching money from left and right and claiming that a transaction has taken place. The net effect is that 30% of the money, less 30% of the money has actually been paid. So it's still a net payer. And that net payment comes from the other people who are collecting. So it is not true. And that's why you cannot get government at 100% of employment. So we need to understand that accounting reality. And the accounting reality is everybody who works from the public sector is a net recipient of income on their income side. That's basic mathematics. Mr. Kafira, you talked about public sector spending, education, 600. And I know one of the things that I sat in an argument a couple of years back when the housing levy was up there. And one of the things of which one of the members of parliament that people think understands economics very, very well, and is a chair of, I think, the budget committee, was saying we are spending 600 billion shillings on education. Guy. And we are supposed to be impressed by that. Look, the government of Kenya collects almost 3 trillion shillings in taxes. 600 billion shillings on education, true. But if you look at primary education, which has 12 million children, close to 13 million children, if you look at the numbers that come from the National Bureau of Statistics and from the Ministry of Education, the Education Management Information Systems, about 11, 12 million children, the capitation grant for public education in primary schools is only 40 billion, which is how many days? 5 days of taxation. Equivalent to the entire spending of parliament for 600 people. Do you guys see that comparison? So people should not deflect us by mentioning big numbers. That's one. Two, of the 600 billion that was mentioned, typically 400 billion or thereabouts is payments to teachers, and there are 300,000 of them. So I think the way we frame these questions can also give that impression. Now, that's not to mention, and our argument must not be, we'd like government to concentrate on pure public goods, but the argument is not that education should not be supported and health should not be supported. The argument is just because that constitutional public good has been created by a constitutional requirement does not mean that government has to provide it. So if you think about one of the other things, in addition to all the things that government does and employs 1 million people, part of that is because government runs close to about 30,000, 33,000 schools, primary schools, secondary schools, and all that. So yes, the choice about the model of delivery is one other question of efficiency that government can. And so while Finland has chosen, because this is a country of 5 million people, and has chosen that there will be all public education will be funded by the state, that's still okay. If those are more efficient forms, that's the constitutional or the social agreement, consensus that has been established. What we are trying to say is when you understand that you expand what is called a public good, it has implications for taxes, it has implications for government footprint, it has implications for the number of people employed by the public sector. And the larger the number of people employed by the public sector, the higher the share of our income, of every individual's income that government will appropriate for that purpose. It is not to say that we should not spend on that. The implications for inequality are obvious. Obviously in Kenya, The lower you go to the level of service, whether health or education, the more poor people are served by it. But you have to know, even in education and health in Kenya, in health, for instance, almost 40, depending on what estimates you got, 40 to 60% of all spending on health comes from private pockets, where people, in addition to your, call them NHIF, whatever those acronyms measure, people still use most of them because those services are suboptimal. And we must understand that in Kenya, the biggest constraint to public provision of services is an income effect, in the sense that our incomes are low. When the US, UK had incomes of our equivalent, their spending was less than 10% of GDP. Kenya's is almost double that. So we have to be careful. And I'll already tell you that for our income level, Kenya's expenditure is already twice as large as other countries that have been larger. I mean, that have grown since have been. So government should be performing much, much better than it is now. Otieno, you asked a question about what should we expect from KRA. I mean, no, so from the courts, and my colleague Leo, yes, too, the sub judice rule about not preempting what courts will find. But this is what I suspect if you've seen the drift. I'll take my public choice hat, which suggests that bureaucracies tend to protect each other. Different arms of government tend to protect each other. There's been communication to the courts coming from some of these broad things that government needs this revenue to provide better public service. Remember, the judiciary is itself paid from public services, from public taxes. I think they'll provide the easement that government provides, and they probably will qualify the Finance Act. And even if they don't, Kenyan courts have taken to doing something that's very, very interesting. In a pure constitutional theory, when a court finds that an action by parliament is unconstitutional, that's the end of it. It is not for the court to then advise parliament by saying, we expend time to you so that you can go and fix it, because that is equivalent to courts legislating on behalf of parliament. So if you've seen the drift of things over the last 2 years, I think they're going to provide easement to maybe chop a few things here, but my thinking is that they're going to actually validate this, and so the taxes will stand. Finally, as I end, you already know that in addition to 77 departments or 77 different board heads, there are almost 400 different state corporations. So as I end, one of the things that I'd like Kenyans or Parliament particularly to adopt is something that has been adopted by Eastern European countries, some of whom did very well, such as Poland. I don't know if the rule still exists, but Poland and the Czech Republic, and I think even the UK used to have that, have this idea that, look, if government establishes one state corporation, a new state corporation comes to parliament and says, look, we want to establish the department for the distribution of bananas to kids for lunch, and that's a very legitimate purpose. And you say that it comes from the fact that everybody has a right to sound nutrition, which is in the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights is very important. The thing Parliament will say is this: if you're going to establish a new place, a new institution, then you have to abolish another one to replace it, so that it's in replacement. So you say, we have capped public institutions at 400. Thereafter, if you need one, you're going to have to cut another in order to get us a new one. And its budgets will go to this new one. And that allows for some kind of thinking, because I think there's been a proliferation of institutions, to be honest, organizations. Everybody comes up. So we have a coconut fund, we have a sugar fund, we have all manner of funds. And to protect against that appetite for creating institutions and organizations which people in the bureaucracy has, Parliament could help us by saying, if we have 400, some of which have only 6 or 7 people, and their last report was a couple of years back, if you want us to expand your remit by establishing a new goal, a new institution to measure something or to provide standards for consumers, tell us where should we cut an equivalent, so that you have those numbers up there. Because otherwise, the human mind is fertile, and we can find every reason, every single reason to have an organization that would justify its work by trying to protect the public or to provide a reason for its existence and appropriating more money for the public from the public purse. Thank you.
Okay. So we've come to the end of this discussion today. For those who had requested, the presentation will be available on IEA's website after this meeting, so you can access it there. Thank you all for staying to the end of this discussion, and we hope that it's been useful to you. The IEA is a membership institution, so for those of you who are interested in becoming members, we invite you to get in touch with our communications team. My colleague Michelle will be able to assist you. So thanks again to all of you for being here, and we wish you a good afternoon. Thanks.